Welcome back, all my ones out there. So good to see you again. If you're just joining, hi, I'm One. I post fun content like this one, so if you're just consider subscribing and check my out Saturday. So today we're going to finally get into the actual first story for the Jake Howlett saga. This is the video that you guys have probably been waiting for forever since I started this series. So the first title is going to be The Son of Wolverine. So how this is going to work, I'm going to go over most of it, but I'm not going to go over the full story because we'd be here for hours. But I'm planning on making this video like an hour and a half or something like that, so I'm going to go over most of it. So sit back, relax, enjoy some snacks, and let's just get into the story, The Son of Wolverine. So, Jake's story starts in a lab. He has been under experiments from William Stryker for the first 10 years of his life. They're experimenting on him to plan to make him the weapon that Logan never could be. Of course, Jake knows that his father was Logan. Stryker has been deceiving him and telling him that his father was a monster and a mistake. So Jake lives in like a little kind of cubicle cell with three of his friends, Bella, Dane, and Trey. Sorry, I forgot their names for a second. So they're all basically friends. So they're just hanging out in their like cubicle little cell that they have until Stryker comes and brings Jake out to experiment on it. The way they're experimenting on him is they put him on this little like whitish table with a bunch of needles poking from the ceiling, and they put him to sleep and they extract it into it. Their plan is to give Jake the adamantium claws that Logan had, because right now Jake only has the bone claws. So when Jake gets onto the table, he's strapped in. He's put under anesthetic that's strong enough to knock him even if he has his healing factor, and he goes into a dream. And the dream's always the same. It's him as a baby with two other figures, which we can assume either his mom or his dad. His dad has this kind of soothing honey voice, but still very gruff, as we can probably just tell that's Logan. And his mother, we don't really know much about her, but we will find out later. Jake wakes up with a disappointing, scowling face of Stryker staring down at him, and Jake knows that this procedure once again failed. Stryker then takes him back to the cell, and Jake gets angry, seeing how bad he and his friends have been treated. So Jake is an inventor. He invents stuff, and that will come in later in future projects of this series. So for the last couple months, Jake has been making like a sort of like kind of key thing to override the Stryker system to get them out of the cell. He tries to convince the rest of his friends to come with him so they can all just be mutants together and live happily ever after. So, and the three of them and the three friends just stand there and be quiet. As Jake opens the door, a slight smile comes to his face, and then suddenly everything goes black. Jake wakes up once again on the experiment table, strapped down very tightly so he can't even move, and he finds Stryker standing over him, and behind him his three friends. Jake scowls, finding out that Bella, Dane, and Trey have betrayed him for protection from Stryker, and this is also the reason why they don't really get experimented on, because Stryker made a deal with them to keep Jake in this facility at all times. So Stryker then reveals his plan. He plans to cut open Jake and just extract the adamantium straight into his bones directly. No adamantium liquid, he just plans to use a syringe and just extract the adamantium straight into his bones. So, as he gets out a scalpel to cut open Jake's chest, an explosion comes from the wall, and everything goes into smoke. Jake is blinded by the smoke, but he can still hear punching and kicking and blasting all around him. When the smoke clears, he sees a man in a colorful blue costume with a gold visor and flashing red eyes standing over him. Jake flinches as he thinks this is still a bad guy, but then he quickly looks down onto the man's boat and quickly sees an X symbol. Realizing that this is Cyclops, the leader of the X-Men, Jake has been educated for the last 10 years over a lot of things that happened in New York City, but he still doesn't really understand why Cyclops has come. Cyclops then uses his optic blast to blast off Jake's restraints and holds out his hand, telling him it's okay, we're gonna get you out of here, in a very affirmative voice. Jake is hesitant, but he then takes his hand because he realizes anywhere's better than here. He then runs past a woman named Jean Grey, which he quickly bonds with the two of them as they take him to the Blackbird to take him to the school. On the way there, Cyclops sits him down in a chair and gives him some water. Jake quickly takes it and drinks it and then apologizes and then thanks Cyclops for the save. Cyclops smiles and pats Jake on the back and says, "You can call me Scott." Then, as Scott goes over to the pilot to make sure they're on course, Jean walks over to him and looks at him with concerned eyes. She's very worried. She describes that she's worried about him and wants to know what she can do for him to make him feel more comfortable. Jake smiles back and says, "Nothing. I'm just happy to be out of there." They talk for a while, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, Jake sees the biggest building he has ever seen in his first 10 years of life. He sees a mansion with a bunch of kids playing basketball on the basketball court, and the Blackbird descends into the mansion itself. When the doors open, Jake's greeted with a few more faces of the X-Men. This includes Hank, aka Beast, Storm, Rogue, and Gambit. They all smile at him, not giving him any discomforting thoughts. They all try to make him feel welcome as they bring him to the kitchen to get some food and some water. Jake is thankful for his new hospitality, but then he quickly asks why did they save him. Hank quickly answers this, being the genius that he is. He explains that their mission is to keep all mutants safe from people who might experiment on them. Sadly, Jake is still upset over the betrayal of his three friends and asks, could we go back to save them? Cyclops then says that's not possible, considering that as they are with Stryker, they probably won't want to be saved. Jake agrees, and then Jean and Storm show him to his room. It's a beautiful room. It's much better than the cell he was living in, with a bed, a TV, and books to read to keep him entertained. Then, all of a sudden, there's a knock at the door, and Jake looks back and sees a man in a wheelchair and knows instantly that that's Professor Charles Xavier, the co-leader of the X-Men, and the founder of this entire school. Charles asks for a moment alone with Jake, and Storm and Jean leave them and close the door behind them. Jake is kind of scared because even though this man is in a wheelchair, he still knows he can go inside his head and do unspeakable things to him. But when Charles looks at him, he just smiles and asks kindly, "Are you okay?" Jake answers yes, and then Charles asks him to take a seat. Jake does as he's told, and they start chatting. And Charles asks, does he know who his father is? And before Jake could even answer, Charles answers for him. He claims he already knows what he's thinking, considering he's a telepath, and he knows what people are thinking. Jake frowns, and Charles asks what's wrong. Jake rehearses everything that Stryker told him for the last 10 years, claiming that his father was a monster and he wants nothing to do with his powers. Charles looks at him kind of befuddled and asks, why don't you want to accept your father? Jake then clenches his fist, and three sharp bone claws come out of his hand. Jake then explains to Charles that every time he sees those claws, he's reminded of the terrible things Logan has done. Charles smiles and then motions Jake to follow him. Jake follows him to the base where the X-Men do their planning for attacks. But instead of going into the war room, Charles takes him down an elevator. Jake is kind of wondering what is going on, but he doesn't question what Charles is trying to show him. Charles takes Jake to an alcove filled with a bunch of computers, suits, and the one that's covered is straight in, and a suit that's covered is straight in the middle of the room. Charles leads him over to that suit casing and asks Jake to pull down the curtain. Jake does this, and he sees his father's old suit, the classic yellow and blue Wolverine suit. Jake looks into it and realizes that he is a perfect fit for it, but he refuses to put it on. He then tries to cover it up, but Charles asks him not to, explaining that even though Logan did some very bad things, he also did some great things. Charles then says, "We need you to hope again," because being a telepath, he knows that Jake has lost hope in everything that he is over the last 10 years. Charles then leaves him alone, and Jake just stares at the suit for a long time. His memories then come all the way back to the dream he always had him Stryker put him under experiments. The soothing, honey gruff voice of a man, and he realizes that this was Logan all this whole time. Of course, Jake somehow always knew that, but he never wanted to accept it. And he still doesn't really accept his father, so instead, he covers up the suit and follows Charles up through the elevator. When he comes up, Charles isn't there, but standing in front of him is Remy LeBeau, Gambit. He and Jake quickly bond and become very best friends, and then later that day and the next day, Remy shows him around campus and a bunch of other stuff, and a bunch of the stuff that the X-Men do. Remy and Jake then partake in a basketball game and dominate the other team, and Jake has never had this much fun in his life, so he's enjoying himself immensely. And then while they were walking down the campus, something catches Jake's eye. It's Rogue fixing a building, a part of the building that once was destroyed in a battle that almost destroyed the school. Remy then moves Jake along, and then they go back inside. Jean is actually standing there watching Jake with a sweet smile, realizing that this is the first time that Jake has ever been around people that are actually kind to him, so she doesn't interfere. Scott then appears while Jake and Remy are walking down the hallway and asks for Jake for a minute. Jake then is taken back to the alcove of his father, and Scott explains some things. He explains that his father built this very alcove with his bare hands, and claiming that this is his own hideout aside from the X-Men. Jake notices that there was a little flare behind Scott's glasses, and then Scott continues. He claims that he never really liked his father, but he got along with him in his final moments. Jake doesn't answer, and Scott puts a hand on his shoulder, claiming that he knows how it feels to not accept your father. And Jake says, Jake claims that he's not cut out to be an X-Men, and he never will be, and he never wants to be anything related to Logan. Scott understands, but then pushes him to keep trying. He then states that Charles wants him to undergo training to become an X-Men. Jake's hesitant, but then follows Scott to the danger room. Scott then puts Jake in a really egotistic suit, one of the older X-Men suits with just a X on the symbol and a yellow vest. Scott, Jake then looks up in the window and sees Charles, Scott, and Jean in the control room, ready to begin the test. Jake then looks ahead and sees a door opening, and a robot the size of him steps out. It then pulls out a bow staff and tries to attack Jake. Jake dodges and doesn't try to fight back. Seeing this, Charles tries to increase the difficulty, but Scott stops him, stating that he will get used to this, we just have to give him time. A few minutes later, Jake's still fighting the same robot, so Scott allows Charles to upgrade the difficulty, making then the robot rips the staff apart and then pulls out two double swords. Jake then is scared for his life, so he finally brings out the bone claws, and since he's very fast and can heal very quickly, he manages to tear the robot to shreds in no time. Charles then speaks over the intercom and claims that he did a good job, but Jake doesn't answer because he never wants to see those claws. It pains him every time they come out, and it just reminds him that he's the son of a monster. He then tries to walk away, but the room won't let him, and Charles locks the whole building down. And so Jake has no choice but to complete the training simulator. After what felt like hours, Jake has beat 10 robots in one go, and Charles finally lets him go. Scott then finds Jake in the alcove a few days later, and asks him if he's okay. Jake doesn't answer, and then Scott looks up past him and sees a bag packed. He realizes that Jake wants to leave, but he doesn't let him. He then tries to stop Jake from grabbing the bag, and Jake has to push him away. Scott then looks at Jake with a softening look and tries to calm him down a little bit, saying that he knows how he feels again, but Jake brushes him out, saying, "You don't know what it's like to be me." Scott says, "You're right, I don't, but you can't just run away from your problems every time." Scott then states that he won't try to stop Jake from leaving, but he wants him to consider that he can have a family here if he wanted. He then leaves, and Jake looks at the bag, and then his eyes differ over to his father's suit. He still wants nothing to do with his father, but he knows that the X-Men can help him, and this is his shot at having a real family. So Jake becomes more comfortable with using his claws, but never wants to become what his father was, thinking Logan was still a monster. And then he forms a great relationship with Remy, with all the X-Men, and he lives his life really good. 9 years pass, and Jake is woken up by a large bang. So Jake is 19 at this point, because he was 10 9 years ago, so he's 19. So Jake rushes out of his room and realizes that there's a helicopter landing on the school grounds. Jake recognizes a helicopter as Stryker's, so he quickly backs away. The rest of the X-Men appear behind him, and they walk past him to confront Stryker. Stryker comes up a little bit older, and his eyes don't even focus on the X-Men. It focuses straight on Jake, who's standing behind the X-Men with claws extended. He claims that he hasn't changed one bit, and Jake growls silently. Stryker then gives the X-Men a warning. They have 2 days to turn over Jake to him so they can experiment on him more, or he blows up the whole entire school. The X-Men, of course, don't take this deal right away, but then a few hours later, Jake hears the X-Men in the war room discussing their options. He hears Hank blast out that they should not do this, and Jake is not an experiment, whereas some of the X-Men are considering it. But no one actually flat out says it. Cyclops uses his affirmative voice to calm the commotion down, and Charles uses his telepathic energy to soothe everyone's minds. Charles then speaks that Jake is one of them, and they never give up an X-Men to save the school. But some of the X-Men grumble and don't really agree with this. Jake then enters the war room, and everyone's shocked to see him. Jake then offers to leave the school so no one gets hurt, and Stryker will come after him. Scott and Jean and Charles are the first ones to define this, but then Jake lashes back, saying that he's not a kid anymore, he's an adult, and he can make his own decisions. Remy stands up and tries to... Remy follows Jake out of the war room and tries to convince him otherwise to not go. Jake looks at Remy and smiles and says he's been a good friend, but he needs to face this alone. So the next morning, Jean tries to bring Jake breakfast, but he's already been gone. He's stolen a motorbike from the alcove and has left. Scott, Jean, Remy, and the rest of the X-Men go on a search mission to find them. Scott and Jean are placed on one team, while the rest of the X-Men search around the school, claiming that he might not be gone, he might just be hiding. Jean and Scott are worried because other than Remy and Charles, Jake has the most history with them, considering they saved him. They think they can bring him back, but they will be difficult. We then flash forward to Jake in a wilderness, in the wild. He plans to survive there as long as he can, because he knows he's never going back to Stryker, but he knows he can't put the X-Men or his friends and family in danger. Jake tries to come to terms with his thoughts, thinking what he should do. Should he fight Stryker, or should he just keep running? He then hears a helicopter and Stryker, and then he sees Stryker's helicopter land just a few miles ahead of him. Jake is hesitant to even approach the helicopter, but he realizes that he needs to confront Stryker to keep the X-Men safe. Since Jake is trained for the last 9 years in the danger room, and he's more experienced and less scared of Stryker now. So when he approaches the helicopter and a million guns are trained on him, Jake doesn't flinch, but he's still scared. Stryker then comes out clapping, stating that he looks just like his father. Jake extends the claws and tells him to never come near him or the X-Men again. Stryker laughs and tells him that he owns him, that he has no choice whatsoever. He then grabs his own kind of weapon with adamantium bullets, saying that this is the one thing that can hurt, saying that this will hurt really bad, and Jake just laughs and lunges at Stryker. A net gun is fired from the helicopter and traps Jake in it. The soldiers grab the net and try to drag him off, but then they hear the rumbling sound of the Blackbird. Scott and Jean jump out of the plane and fend off the guards, and Jake manages to use his claws to cut through the rope. Stryker realizes he's unmatched and quickly leaves in the helicopter before he can be captured by the X-Men. Jake goes back to the mansion with Scott and Jean, and they have a serious discussion with him. Scott says, "Why did you run?" And Jake replies that he did it to protect them all. Jean says that it's not his job to protect them, but Jake looks at her and says, "I'm the one he wants, so why should we be hurting the rest of you to save me?" Charles then appears and says because he's special. Jake then gets a little angry and lashes out at Charles, claiming that he's not special, he's the son of a monster, not a hero. Scott then tells Jake to follow him. He brings him back to the war room, and he shows him a few videos of his father fighting alongside the X-Men. He shows him that time and time again Logan sacrificed himself for good and never won. And sure, there were times that Scott wanted to blast him into the next century, but he always fought for what he thought was right. Jake doesn't believe this and tries to storm out, but Charles then appears right in the doorway, saying that Scott is right and that Logan was one of the best mutants Charles ever knew. And for the first time in 19 years, Jake finally gets a little notion that his father might not be the monster that everyone around him said he was. He then goes back to the alcove and stares at his father's suit for a long time. He then whispers that he still doesn't. He whispers to the suit, thinking that his father is still there, and he can hear him, stating that I wish I wasn't your son, but I can't blame the world. He wonders why he then spends the next 2 days in the war room trying to figure out why his father abandoned him to Stryker in the first place, considering that was the only place he ever knew. Then all of a sudden, alarm goes off and the TV flickers. Stryker then appears in a really dark room and he's actually much more different than Jake remembered. He's more bulkier, and he has adamantium, and then Stryker reveals that he pumped adamantium into his own skeleton. So Jake asks how he got that, and Stryker answers, because I still had some from your father. He claimed that he was strong enough for the procedure, and now he is part mutant. Stryker then motions the camera behind him, and he finds the rest of the X-Men in tubes captured. Jake glares, and Stryker gives him an opportunity to save them. He states that he has 2 hours to come over and to be his forever, or he kills every single of the X-Men that takes their powers for himself. Jake gets so angry that he lunges his claws at the TV, breaking it. Jake then ponders this for the next few minutes, and then realizes that the only way to stop Stryker is to be like his father. But he realizes that the bone claws won't be able to withstand against Stryker himself, considering that. So he decides to pump the adamantium into him. So Jake goes out into the wilderness and calls out Stryker. Sadly, Stryker doesn't appear with the helicopter this time. Instead, it's just a bunch of scientists. Jake takes one of them hostage and brings him back to the mansion. He orders him to experiment on him and to fuse the adamantium into his skeleton. The scientist laughs and asks him why he should do that, and so Jake imitates him by putting his bone claws into his lap and says that's why. So, limping, the scientist brings Jake into the helicopter and brings him to the same location where Logan got his adamantium. He then puts him on the table and puts him under anesthetic. Now, this time, Jake wonders how this will work, considering Stryker tried this for years and never was managed to get the adamantium in. The scientist reveals that it wasn't the adamantium that was the problem. It was you. Your body couldn't accept it because you knew. Your body wouldn't accept it because you wouldn't accept who you were. Jake is confused, but he then understands that in order for him to actually become his father's son, he had to become what he most hated. Now, the way this worked, before we get into the rest of it, the way this worked kind of is basically the adamantium wasn't going. The problem wasn't the adamantium. The problem was that Jake wasn't accepting the adamantium because he believed that his father was a monster. The mistake that Stryker made was telling Jake that his father was a monster. So by Jake thinking that his father was a monster, he wouldn't allow his body to accept the adamantium. Alright, back to the story. So, Jake is then put under anesthetic and goes through the same procedure that Logan did for the adamantium bonding. He then feels hot. All his memories from the last 9 19 years come flashing back to him. The experience that Stryker put him under, his friend's betrayal, and the X-Men training him to become a hero. Then Jake finds himself in a very bright light and wonders what's going on. Then the same gruff, honey voice from his dreams speaks behind him. He turns around and sees Logan in his classic X-Men suit standing before him. Jake asks one question: why did he abandon him? And Logan asks, "I didn't mean to." He then tells him that when Stryker came to take Jake, Logan tried to fight him off. But sadly, the adamantium was still poisoning him, so he was much slower than he used to be. Stryker managed to put an adamantium bullet into his head, killing him. And since Jake was a baby at this time, he couldn't defend himself, so he had no choice but to go with Stryker. Jake is sad in that because all these years he blamed his father for something he couldn't even control, and he tried to hug him, but then the memory faded and he woke up. Jake then looks at his hands and then clenches his fists. Instead of bone claws, which he's used to, three metal claws on each hand sprout from him, and he feels much more stronger and more faster. Jake then dismisses the scientists and the scientists leave. Jake then goes down to the alcove, and finally, for the first time in his life, he's not angry every time he looks at his father's suit. He then puts on his father's suit, and he finally accepts that he's Logan's son. He then takes the spare Blackbird and goes over to Stryker's lab. He promised himself he'd never go back here, and so once he entered the building, it brought back painful memories. He then finds the room where the X-Men are still in the tube, and when he tries to break them out, Stryker appears behind him with blades coming out of his whole entire arm. Stryker laughs and says he's stubborn just like his father, and Jake glares at him, replying that he's done running from who he is. They then engage in an epic battle, and Jake is still a little woozy from the procedure, but he still is strong and fast. After defeating Stryker, he wants to kill him. He wants to slash his throat and kill him, but that he realizes that true pain came from leaving him to suffer and deal with the consequences. So instead of killing him, he releases the X-Men and puts Stryker into the tube, leaving him there so the authorities can have him. Later, when they get back to the mansion, Charles smiles at him and says, "You finally have hope again." Jake smiles and heads down to the alcove, and then, just before the screen goes black, we see armor specs for Jake is planning to build an armor for himself. So, what do you think of that birth of the son of the Wolverine? I'm very excited to see what you guys think of this story, and also let me know, because the next project is actually the first season of a TV show series that's going to be in this saga. So let me know if you guys want the next video to be just like this, where I just go over the major details and not go over all of it, or if you guys want me to do every single individual episode one by one. So, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Wyatt, signing out. Remember, peace and kindness, the things we need most. Stay wild.